It was the summer of 2025 when America's worst nightmare began to take shape. The first reports came from a small, isolated town in the Midwest, an outbreak of a strange illness. At first, no one paid much attention. It seemed like just another viral strain, one of the many diseases that had come and gone in the past. But soon, the unthinkable began happening. People who were infected didn't die, or at least not in the way anyone had ever expected. They didn't turn into shambling corpses, but rather, they became something far worse, something not quite human. Their eyes glazed over, their skin turned an unnatural shade of gray, and their movements were jerky, animalistic. The infection spread like wildfire. By the time the government issued a nationwide alert, it was already too late. In cities, small towns, and rural farmlands alike, the undead grew in numbers. The media called them the undead, a term that both encapsulated their unnatural nature and sparked fear in the hearts of millions. They weren't like the slow, lumbering zombies that filled B-movie flicks. These creatures moved with terrifying speed and ferocity, driven by a primal hunger for flesh. Major cities fell quickly, and the government struggled to respond. Military units were deployed to contain the outbreak, but they were no match for the hordes that surged forward, overwhelming the armed forces in record time. The undead attacked without mercy, and in their wake, a once proud nation crumbled. Amid the chaos, some regions managed to survive, though life as the people knew it was forever altered. Small enclaves of resistance fighters began to form, but they were scattered and uncoordinated. The United States, as a unified power, had ceased to exist. In its place were fractured pockets of humanity, clinging to life in a world that had gone mad. One such pocket was located in the ruins of what had once been New York City. In the heart of the city, a group of survivors had taken refuge in the basement of an old skyscraper, a symbol of what the world had once been. This group was led by Emma Taylor, a former police officer who had witnessed the rapid downfall of society firsthand. Now, she had become the de facto leader of the group, struggling not only to keep them safe, but also to hold onto a glimmer of hope. Emma sat at a small table in the dimly lit basement, studying the maps that had become her constant companions. She traced a line from the northern suburbs to the southern tip of the island, her eyes scanning for any signs of safety, any potential source of supplies. But it was becoming clear that the city was no longer safe. The undead had begun to infiltrate the outer layers of their makeshift sanctuary. Her mind raced as she reviewed their dwindling resources. Food was running low. The medical supplies were barely enough to treat the wounded, let alone prevent infection. And worst of all, there had been reports of larger, more organized hordes in the area. Emma couldn't ignore the gnawing fear at the back of her mind, the fear that they were running out of time. She looked up as a voice interrupted her thoughts. It was Marcus, a former military officer who had become one of her closest allies. His face was lined with exhaustion, but his eyes were sharp, ever watchful. "Emma, we've got a problem," Marcus said, his voice low but urgent. "There's a convoy of survivors trying to reach us from the west side. They're being chased by a large group of undead. If we don't help them, they won't make it here." Emma's heart sank. The survivors were no doubt desperate, but the undead were relentless. Even if they made it to the skyscraper, how long could they last with so many of them? It was a gamble, but Emma knew they had little choice. Without fresh blood, without new resources, their group would collapse. "Get the others ready," she said, her voice steady despite the growing tension in her chest. "We're going out there." As the survivors quickly gathered their weapons and prepared for what would likely be a dangerous mission, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking straight into a trap. The undead were growing more strategic, more coordinated. Was it possible that they were evolving? Minutes later, Emma and a small team of fighters emerged from the relative safety of their hiding place. The city streets were eerily silent, but the unmistakable sounds of chaos, the growls and snarls of the undead, could be heard in the distance. Emma tightened her grip on her rifle, her mind alert and focused. The convoy of survivors had been sighted several blocks away, but getting there was another story entirely. The streets were littered with wreckage, abandoned cars, and the remnants of what had once been civilization. A chilling wind blew through the ruined skyscrapers, carrying with it the scent of decay. As they approached the location, Emma signaled for her team to spread out. Their mission was simple: get the survivors, get them back to safety, and avoid unnecessary contact with the undead. But even as Emma surveyed the area, she had a sinking feeling that this wouldn't be as easy as it seemed. Suddenly, a scream pierced the air, followed by a loud crash. Emma's heart raced as she turned toward the sound. It was the survivors. They had been spotted. The hunt had begun. The scream echoed through the decimated streets, carrying with it the weight of desperation. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as she motioned for her team to move faster, adrenaline surging through her veins. She had no illusions. This wasn't going to be a simple rescue. The undead were closing in, and there was no time to waste. "Go," she barked, and the group sprinted towards the source of the chaos. As they rounded the corner, the sight was worse than Emma had feared. The convoy of survivors, a ragtag group of men, women, and children, had been cornered by a horde of the undead. The survivors were desperately fighting back with makeshift weapons, but the odds were hopeless. The undead moved with terrifying speed, surrounding the group with inhuman precision. Emma's eyes scanned the scene, calculating their options. The survivors were being pushed towards an alley, a dead end. There was no way out unless they made a stand, and fast. Her instincts kicked in, and without a second thought, she raised her rifle and fired, the loud crack of the gunshot cutting through the air. A few of the undead fell, their skulls cracking open under the force of the bullets. "Cover fire. Move up," she shouted to her team, who instantly understood the mission. They spread out, engaging the undead at different angles. Emma's pulse quickened as she squeezed the trigger again and again, each shot taking down another one of the creatures. But there were too many of them. More seemed to appear out of the shadows, drawn by the noise and movement. "Fall back! Fall back!" Marcus yelled, his voice strained as he too picked off the undead. He had no choice but to retreat with the others. There was no way to hold their ground. Emma's mind raced. They couldn't afford to lose any more lives. The survivors, exhausted and panicked, were barely managing to keep up with the retreat. Emma shot a glance over her shoulder to see the growing wave of undead pursuing them. They were relentless, like a tide, rising higher and higher. "Get to the building," Emma yelled, signaling to her group to move towards the nearby structure, a half-collapsed parking garage. It would give them a defensive position, at least for a little while. But as they ran, something felt off. The undead were moving with unnatural precision, coordinating their attacks like a well-trained army. It was as if they were adapting, and that thought made Emma's blood run cold. She had seen her share of horrors in the weeks since the outbreak, but this was something new. They reached the parking garage, but as they got inside, Emma realized that the survivors' condition was rapidly deteriorating. Some were injured. Others were clearly too frightened to even hold their weapons properly. And then there were the children, wide-eyed and shaking, clinging to their parents for dear life. Marcus and Emma quickly set up a perimeter with the rest of the fighters. The undead were still outside, milling about in eerie silence for a moment. It was too quiet, too still. Then, the sound of feet scraping against the pavement came, followed by an eerie screech that made everyone in the garage flinch. The undead were circling, waiting for the right moment to strike. "Keep your heads down and stay quiet," Emma whispered, her voice steady despite the growing dread in her chest. "We're going to wait this out. Stay calm." They waited, and waited. The minutes dragged on like hours. Emma's nerves were stretched thin as she scanned the streets through a small crack in the wall. The undead outside were still lurking, but there was something different about them. They were moving in tight formations, almost as if they were following orders. Emma's thoughts raced. Was this possible? Were the undead being controlled by something or someone? She couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a random outbreak. This had purpose. And it was clear that their struggle was far from over. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by the unmistakable sound of banging. Something was hitting the garage door. Emma's heart skipped a beat. The undead had found them. "Get ready," she shouted, signaling to her team to take their positions. They'd been cornered before, but this time they were up against something more dangerous. The undead were no longer just mindless predators. They were strategizing, calculating their moves. As the first undead slammed into the garage door, Emma could hear the metallic groan of the structure beginning to give way. The door would hold for now, but for how long? Every second felt like an eternity as the horde pressed closer, their growls growing louder. "Emma, we can't hold out here forever," Marcus said, his voice tight with tension. "We need to do something, now." She nodded grimly, her mind racing. Their options were limited, and they didn't have much time before the undead would breach the garage. But then, an idea flashed into her mind. A risky move, but it was the only chance they had. "Okay," she said, her voice determined. "We're going to have to fight our way through." With no time to waste, Emma began to organize her team, rallying the survivors to fight alongside them. Every moment counted. They couldn't afford to let the undead take them. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about taking back what had been stolen from them. As the first of the undead smashed through the door, Emma and her team charged forward, their weapons raised. The battle was about to begin, and this time they would not run. The garage door rattled violently as another undead slammed into it, the metallic groan echoing through the concrete walls. Emma's heart pounded in her chest, but there was no time to waste. She could feel the weight of the decision settling in her bones. There was no retreat left, no place to hide. They had to fight their way out. The undead outside were closing in, relentless and swift. The air inside the garage was thick with tension, every survivor on edge, clutching weapons like lifelines. Emma knew that every second they stayed here weakened their position. But if they moved too soon, they risked being torn apart in the open. She turned to Marcus, who was securing the rear with a few of the other fighters. "We need to push out now," she said, her voice low but unwavering. "They won't stop until we're all gone." Marcus nodded, his jaw clenched. "I'll take the rear. You lead the front." Emma glanced over at the survivors, who were huddled near the back of the garage, too terrified to even lift their weapons. Most of them were civilians, ordinary people who hadn't been prepared for this kind of horror. There was no time to train them, no time for elaborate plans. Survival was the only strategy now. "Listen up," she called, her voice echoing off the concrete. "We're moving out. Stay close to me. We move fast, and we move together. Follow my lead, and we'll make it out alive." "Understood." A chorus of murmurs and nods came in response, though not all of them were filled with confidence. Still, they had no choice. Emma drew her sidearm, the weight of the pistol grounding her thoughts. She glanced at Marcus once more. He was ready. "On my mark," Emma said. 3, 2, 1. With a swift motion, she kicked the door open, sending a blast of stale air into the street. The world outside was a broken, apocalyptic landscape, empty cars, burned-out buildings, and the constant presence of the undead, lurking in the shadows, waiting for their next victim. The first wave of undead had already begun to charge at them, their grotesque, decaying forms moving with unnatural speed. Emma squeezed the trigger, sending a bullet into the nearest one's skull. The sound of gunfire filled the air as her team opened up on the approaching horde, but the undead kept coming. For every one that fell, 2 more seemed to take its place. "Keep moving," Emma shouted. "Don't stop." Her team advanced, using the cover of abandoned vehicles and debris to shield themselves as they pushed through the street. But Emma couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The undead weren't just chasing them, they were tracking them. And the more they fought, the more they were attracting. "Keep your formation," Marcus barked from the rear. "We're about to hit the main thoroughfare. Stay sharp." As they neared the corner, Emma's worst fears were realized. A group of the undead, larger and more organized than the others, had emerged from the shadows, their movements almost coordinated. They were blocking the way, a line of hungry, decaying bodies standing between the survivors and any chance of escape. Emma's mind raced. They had no choice but to fight their way through. "On my signal, we push forward," Emma yelled, her voice sharp with urgency. "Don't hesitate." She could hear the breathless gasps of the survivors behind her, their fear palpable. But Emma had no time for doubt. She steadied her rifle and aimed for the closest undead. A burst of gunfire, and the first line of attackers fell. But they were quickly replaced, and the front line was closing in. Then, something unexpected happened. The undead at the front paused, their bodies momentarily still. Emma froze, her eyes narrowing. For a brief moment, she thought they had been distracted. But then it became clear. The undead weren't acting on instinct anymore. They were waiting, watching. A low, guttural growl rose from somewhere in the middle of the crowd. And then, to Emma's horror, she saw what she dreaded the most, an evolved form of the undead. It was different from the others. Its movements were more deliberate, and its eyes, if you could call them eyes, were sharp, focused, intelligent. The creature's gaze met Emma's, and for the briefest of moments, there was a flicker of recognition. It wasn't just a mindless monster. It was thinking. "Everyone get back." Emma shouted, "Fall back." But it was too late. The evolved undead surged forward, moving faster than any of the others, its long, twisted limbs reaching for the survivors. It had a terrifying presence, something beyond just hunger. Emma's team opened fire, but the creature moved too quickly, dodging and weaving as it made its way toward them. It was like a predator stalking its prey, and Emma realized with sickening clarity that it wasn't just the undead that had evolved. It was leading them. The horde was being controlled, orchestrated by this monster. A shot rang out. It wasn't from Emma's team. Emma whipped her head around, spotting one of the survivors, a man who had been too afraid to fight, holding a rifle shakily in his hands. His shot missed, but the creature's attention shifted toward him. "No," Emma screamed, but it was too late. The evolved undead moved with terrifying speed, reaching the man in an instant. In one violent motion, it tore him apart, his screams swallowed by the roar of the horde. Panic set in, and Emma's team was forced to retreat further. There was no plan now, only survival. She had seen many horrors since the outbreak began, but this was something new. The undead were evolving, becoming more intelligent, more dangerous. And if they were the future of this world, then humanity was in greater peril than anyone had realized. Emma grabbed Marcus by the arm, her eyes wide with fear and determination. "We need to get to the safe zone now." But as the last of the survivors began to fall back, the horde was closing in fast. The creatures were smarter, faster, and Emma realized that this battle was only the beginning. They hadn't just lost ground. They had unleashed a force that might never be stopped. The streets of the ruined city had never felt more suffocating. Emma's breath came in ragged gasps as she led the survivors through the labyrinth of abandoned buildings, her mind still racing from the horrors they had just faced. The evolved undead, their terrifying leader, had almost torn them apart. But by some miracle, they had managed to escape. Barely. The group had regrouped in a crumbling building on the edge of the city. Its skeletal structure provided some protection, but the constant fear of being found kept everyone on edge. The survivors huddled together in the dim, musty interior, their eyes wide with terror. But Emma could see the weariness beginning to settle in. They were broken, and there was no way to hide it. "Emma," Marcus said softly, his voice strained, "we can't keep running. The longer we wait, the more we're exposed. We need to find a permanent solution, or we'll be wiped out." Emma's jaw tightened. He was right. They couldn't keep living like this, moving from one hideout to the next, always fleeing, never fighting back. But how could they stand against what was out there? The undead weren't just random monsters anymore. They were organized, intelligent, and controlled by something far more dangerous than anything they'd faced before. "I know," Emma whispered. She ran a hand through her hair, her thoughts tangled in a web of fear and determination. "But where do we even begin? We've got nothing left. We can't fight an army of evolved undead and expect to win." "We don't have a choice," Marcus said firmly. "We've seen the truth. They're evolving. And if we don't stop them now, there won't be anything left to save." Emma nodded, but her mind was heavy with the weight of their situation. The odds seemed insurmountable. Even if they could somehow strike back, what could they do against a force that was learning, adapting, and growing stronger every day? She turned her attention to the group of survivors. Most were still too frightened to speak, too broken by the trauma of losing everything. But one figure stood apart from the rest: Sarah, a young woman who had been with them since the beginning. Sarah had lost her entire family to the undead, but her survival instinct had kept her going, even when the others had faltered. "Sarah," Emma called, her voice barely a whisper. "What's your take on all this? You've been watching everything. What do we do?" The young woman met her gaze, her eyes filled with a quiet intensity. "We fight," she said simply. "We take the fight to them. It's the only way." Emma couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope at her words. They had to fight back. If they didn't, they'd be nothing more than prey to be hunted. But she needed more than just courage. They needed a plan, a way to strike at the heart of the undead horde before it was too late. "We need to figure out where they're coming from," Marcus added, his voice steady but urgent. "Find the source, and we might have a chance. Maybe there's a way to disrupt whatever's controlling them." Emma nodded, her thoughts already racing. "We'll need to scout, get intel. But we can't do this alone. We'll need more firepower, more resources." Sarah stepped forward, her hands clenched into fists. "I know a place," she said, her voice calm but filled with determination. "A warehouse on the outskirts. My brother was part of a weapons cache there before." She paused, her throat tightening as she swallowed the pain. "Before everything fell apart. If it's still intact, we can get the supplies we need." Emma looked at Marcus, who gave a small, approving nod. They had no other choice. A warehouse full of weapons could give them the firepower to take the fight to the evolved undead, and hopefully give them a fighting chance against whatever was controlling them. "Let's move out," Emma said decisively. "We leave at first light." The night was long, and the quiet of the ruined city felt oppressive, but they couldn't afford to waste any more time. At dawn, they gathered their weapons, fortified what little gear they had left, and prepared for the dangerous journey to the warehouse. Emma's heart was heavy with the knowledge that they might not return, but they had to try. The city streets were as silent as death itself as they moved through the shadows, keeping low and avoiding any signs of the undead. Every corner felt like a potential ambush, but they pushed forward with quiet determination. Emma's thoughts were a whirlwind, but one thought kept resurfacing over and over again. What if the evolved undead were already waiting for them? They reached the outskirts of the city by midday, and the tension only mounted as they approached the warehouse. It loomed ahead, a hulking structure surrounded by rubble and debris. Emma's fingers tightened around the grip of her rifle as she signaled for the group to halt. "Stay sharp," she whispered. "We don't know what's waiting for us inside." They moved cautiously toward the entrance, every step heavy with the fear of the unknown. The door to the warehouse was ajar, and the sound of distant groaning reached Emma's ears. The undead were close. "Quiet," she hissed. But as they entered, the unmistakable stench of decay filled the air. It wasn't just the smell of the undead, it was something worse. A sharp, metallic scent mixed with something darker. Emma's heart sank as her eyes adjusted to the darkness. And then she saw it. The warehouse was filled with bodies, both human and undead. It looked like a massacre. But there, in the center, something caught her eye. A symbol painted in red on the floor, surrounded by broken crates and scattered weapons. It was a mark, a symbol of control. "The evolved undead," Emma muttered, the realization sinking in like ice. This wasn't just random. Someone's been manipulating this. Before she could react, a sound came from the far corner, a deep guttural growl. The evolved undead had found them, and this time it wasn't just one. The warehouse was silent, the weight of what they had discovered hanging heavy in the air. Emma's breath caught in her throat as the low growl reverberated through the walls. She turned, and her eyes locked onto the source of the noise. Emerging from the shadows, it wasn't just one evolved undead this time. It was a dozen, each one more terrifying than the last. Their bodies were twisted and unnatural, their movements more precise, more calculated. They were organized like a squad of predators, and they had been waiting for the survivors. "This is it," Marcus muttered, his voice grim. "They know we're here." Emma's heart pounded, but she didn't have time for fear. Every instinct told her to fight, to survive. This was their chance to take the battle to the undead, to strike at the heart of the horde, but the odds were overwhelmingly stacked against them. The warehouse was their battleground, and their enemies were too numerous, too powerful. "Fall back to the back of the warehouse," Emma ordered, her voice sharp, cutting through the tension. "Get to the loading docks. We'll make our stand there." The survivors scrambled, moving quickly but carefully, not making a sound. Emma knew they couldn't afford to attract more attention. But as they moved deeper into the warehouse, a sickening realization set in. The evolved undead weren't just hunting them. They were hurting them. The survivors had become prey in a trap. "Get ready," Emma whispered to Marcus, who was flanking her with his weapon raised. "They're coming." The first evolved undead lunged toward them, moving faster than anything Emma had ever seen. She fired, the shot hitting its shoulder, but it didn't falter. It turned, eyes glowing with hunger and malice, and charged again. Emma fired a second shot, this one striking its head. It went down, but more surged forward to take its place. "Keep firing," Marcus yelled, his voice hoarse. "We can't let them close the distance." The group fired relentlessly, their guns echoing in the warehouse. Each shot brought one more down, but it felt like they were being swarmed. For every undead they killed, another took its place. Emma's fingers tightened around her rifle, but she knew the truth. They weren't winning. Not yet. Then, as if responding to some unseen signal, the evolved undead began to scatter, breaking formation and spreading out across the warehouse. It was a new tactic, a more dangerous one. "They're circling us," Emma said, her voice laced with desperation. "They're trying to trap us." The survivors' panic was palpable. Emma could see the fear in their eyes as they tried to reload, their hands shaking. This wasn't just a fight for survival anymore. This was a fight for their very existence. "Hold your ground," Emma shouted, trying to keep them focused. "Stay together." But even as she said it, she could feel the walls closing in. They were surrounded. There was nowhere to go. And that's when she saw it. In the center of the warehouse, standing apart from the others, was the one who had started it all, the leader. The evolved undead, its eyes locked onto Emma, radiated an unsettling intelligence. It was different from the others, more powerful, more aware. It wasn't just a monster. It was a commander. And Emma realized that it had been the mastermind behind everything. This was the being controlling the horde. If they could take it down, they might have a chance. "Marcus," Emma said, her voice steady with determination. "We need to take it out. Now." He nodded, his expression hardening. "I'll cover you." They had one shot at this. One chance to end it all. Emma moved forward, weaving through the gunfire and chaos. Her eyes locked on the creature in the center. It watched her approach, its face twisted in an almost mocking smile. But Emma didn't stop. She couldn't. She reached the edge of the warehouse, using the tall stacks of crates for cover, her breath coming in sharp bursts. The evolved undead saw her coming, its eyes narrowing in recognition. It began to move toward her, slow and deliberate. It was expecting her. But Emma wasn't going to play by its rules. "Now," she yelled. Marcus opened fire, his shots ringing out as he distracted the creature. The evolved undead turned, its attention split for just a moment. That was all Emma needed. She lunged forward, sprinting at full speed, her rifle raised. The creature reacted with inhuman speed, its claws slashing at the air, but Emma ducked low, evading its strike. With one final push, Emma fired. The bullet struck the evolved undead in the chest, but it wasn't enough. It kept coming, more enraged than ever, and Emma knew she couldn't take it down with just a rifle. Then, from behind her, she heard a loud crash. One of the survivors, Sarah, had grabbed a nearby pipe and hurled it at the creature with all her strength. The metal pipe struck the evolved undead in the side, throwing it off balance. It staggered, and that was when Emma saw the opening. Without thinking, she ran forward, grabbing a jagged piece of broken glass from the ground. In one fluid motion, she plunged it into the creature's throat, her hands shaking with the force of the strike. The evolved undead's eyes bulged in surprise, but it didn't make a sound. It crumpled to the ground, its body twitching once before falling still. For a moment, everything was silent. Emma stood there, panting, blood staining her hands, the sound of her racing heartbeat the only thing she could hear. It was over. The leader was dead. But the horde was still there. Everyone fall back. Marcus shouted, his voice frantic. We can't stay here. Emma looked at the survivors, who were still alive but battered, and her heart ached. They had won this battle, but the war was far from over. The horde was still out there, and their numbers were growing. They had no safe haven, no certainty that they could survive much longer. But for the first time in weeks, Emma felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. They had taken down the leader. And if they could do that, they could take down the rest. We're not done yet, Emma said, her voice steady, but filled with resolve. We fight on. Together. As they made their way toward the exit, Emma knew that this fight wasn't over. But with the fall of a leader, there was a chance, a real chance, to reclaim what had been lost. The resistance had just begun.